Welcome to Great Business Stories. And in today's episode, we're digging into the Tyco scandal from the early 2000s. Specifically, we're focusing on Tyco CEO, Dennis Kozlowski, who was charged and convicted of stealing $132 million from Tyco to fund a really lavish lifestyle. And while other directors were also charged, and there were additional charges that we don't delve into, we do mention them briefly. However, our main focus is on the primary charges against Kozlowski. What's really unusual about this story is that both Keith and I started our research believing we knew the story. It was a straight up tale of corporate greed, and we expected to uncover why and how Kozlowski siphoned off so much money. But as we dug deeper, the actual story turned out to be pretty different, and it makes for a great episode. We hope you enjoy it.
Morning, Clayman. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. And today our story is Dennis Kozlowski and the Tyco scandal. And you chose this one, so
Well, I guess from the outside at least, it was a story that kind of stuck with me. It was like a Gordon Gekko type kind of greed picture, became emblematic of a period of corruption. So I thought, oh, wow, and particularly the idea of the shower curtain, the $6,000 shower curtain, was a very kind of visual kind of symbol of excess and corporate greed. And I thought this should be entertaining. It should be interesting just to see how extreme this story of greed was. And so I got Catherine Esnail's book and began to read it, and came away with a very different picture of this guy. So I know your approach is obviously a lot more research, but I think what I would say is the story that I went into the book with is very different with the story I took away from the book.
100%, because as you said, I usually do my research outside of the book. When you mentioned Dennis Kozlowski and Tyco, and for listeners who mightn't know, and it was about this big scandal that happened just around the same time that Enron went bankrupt, that WorldCom was coming to the fore, this big financial scandal. So there was all these big financial scandals, and Dennis Kozlowski became the poster boy, really, because of this excessive spending that came out. And when you mentioned Dennis Kozlowski, the first thing that came to my mind was this infamous $6,000 shower curtain as well. The image I had was he was this corporate fat cat who stuck his hand into Tyco, stole tens, if not hundreds of millions, and used it to, pay for a lavish lifestyle.
Yeah.
That was it. And so I started to do my research, and it was very much along those lines, because really the media were reporting on this report that Tyco had released that we're going to talk about. And it had all this lavish lifestyle. But then I came across two articles in Forbes that were written. There's no author under these articles, but they were written in 2005 when the trials were going on. And the first article was titled "The Millions Kozlowski Didn't Steal." And the second article was titled, after the trial, it was like Tyco trial, verdict first, law second. And these articles put a different slant on the whole scandal. And I was like, I didn't know this. I didn't know this is what the actual case was about, because just to tell our listeners what the case centered on, the case centered around 4 large bonuses that Dennis Kozlowski and the CFO, Mark Schwartz, were accused of stealing. But as the Forbes article pointed out, the 4 bonuses were prearranged based on calculations by the compensation committee. They didn't take any more than they were due to them from their bonuses. An awful lot of all the amounts were factored into their accounts in some shape or form. So I was like, okay, I'm not getting any of this information from all the media articles that I read. So then I thought, okay, I got to get a book on it. And the only book we had on it was the Catherine Neal book. It's called Take Down the Line. And now, having done the research on my own and having done Catherine Neal's book, she builds a very, very strong case for Kozlowski. At the same time, I think because she was so gung-ho on proving that Kozlowski was a wronged person, she didn't include a lot of information from the trial that was detrimental to Kozlowski. I remember reading one review of the book, and the reviewer said that she has too many facts in the book. Now, I would say that if you're trying to prove somebody's innocence, you need as many facts as you
Yeah.
can.
Yeah, it's
But there
pretty
was a lot of
fundamental part.
it is. It is. I would say that she did leave out parts that were detrimental to Kozlowski. And if to have a more balanced view, I think she should have included those facts as well and let the reader make up their own mind. Because when I made up my own mind after reading all the facts, I'm very much down on the side of Kozlowski. Are you the same way?
Yeah, I'm the same, but maybe for the benefit of the listeners, then we could maybe kind of fly through the history and then zoom in on the
Exactly.
outcome then and probably kind of give a sense of the media environment at the time, why the public reached their conclusion, and then maybe to talk a little bit about the conclusion we reached, I suppose.
Yeah, and all those are very valid points because especially when you talk about the public mood at that time, because we've got to keep, and we will be mentioning this again, it was post-Enron, and the public and the media had really turned against corporate America at this time.
And don't forget Martha Stewart.
Martha Stewart, I know. She went to jail for, was it like
insider trading, I think.
Yeah, but was the amount, it was like a minuscule amount in terms of her overall net worth. It might be like
I think it was. I don't even think it was that much.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought I was going to say about $30,000. Now, maybe that's the gain on the shares she disposed of in terms of insider trading. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say no to it. But at the same time, in the context of her incredible wealth, it's nothing.
Yeah, it was nothing. But yeah, you're right. Let's get into, first of all, we'll tell our listeners a little bit about Tyco, about Dennis Kozlowski, because Tyco was this huge conglomerate. But
it wasn't, though. It wasn't always.
It wasn't. It wasn't. And Dennis Kozlowski joined us in 1975 when he was 28. And at that time, Tyco was only turning over $20 million.
Yeah.
And it was involved in a wide variety of stuff, like from radio chips to equipment to test helicopter blades to stuff with nuclear submarines, everything and anything. But they did have a new and very aggressive and flamboyant CEO called Joe Graziano. And he had this dream to build Tyco into a $1 billion company through acquisitions. And they were mainly hostile acquisitions. And Kozlowski quickly moved out of the audit department and into operations. And that's where he really started to flourish, because he really got into the detail of every company that they were buying, so that when the company was bought, he was the go-to man to help integrate the company and the man that they wanted to know where and when to cut costs. And he was a workhorse, and he quickly moved up through the organization. But then this Graziano CEO died in 1982 at the age of 47. And then John Ford, this more cautious director, became CEO. But because Kozlowski as his COO, the company still grew very, very quickly over John Ford's tenure. So that by the time it came to 1992, it had a turnover of $3 billion. And Kozlowski was even more aggressive in his dealings. He wanted to grow Tyco even faster. John Ford was pushing back against that, and the board were looking at the growth, seeing that Kozlowski was the engine for growth. And in 1992, they got rid of John Ford, and at 45, Kozlowski became CEO. So that's
it's an incredible kind of meteoric rise for somebody that actually had, reasonably humble background. Unlike Ford, who seems to be part of a well-established and wealthy family, Kozlowski really is a self-made man at this stage.
Very much so. I mean, he came from a working class family in Jersey and put himself through college, worked 30, 40 hours a week to put himself through college.
That's right. He washed cars, and he was in a band as well, I think.
He was in a band. Yeah.
So him and Ray Kroc, maybe it's
exactly.
And it goes with these guys.
And he comes across, like, I know we mentioned words like he was very aggressive, but everything I've read about him, there's been no employees that ever came out and said that he was a dick. They all talk about him being very hardworking, being very dedicated, being very aggressive in his style of business in terms of acquisitions. But I never read a report, and in the interviews I saw with him and with other people, nobody ever really badmouthed his treatment of people or how he actually worked within the company, which was unusual for us to be in that position.
Yeah, I agree. And I think even There's an interview, I think it's Morley Safer for 60 Minutes. That's probably actually, in
Yeah,
retrospect, how he came onto my radar in the first place, because I'm a huge sort of fan of 60 Minutes and I listen to
yeah,
their podcast actually. And he comes across in that, okay, he's in jail, but he's very humble. He doesn't seem particularly bitter. And he's quite pleasant
yeah,
and charming in a way and self-effacing.
yeah,
So great quote in there. That Morty Safer, not to derail too much, Morty Safer says, Donald Trump said that you're tacky. And Kozlowski pauses for a minute and says, well, he'd know. So he's got a sense of humor. He comes across as, you know, and maybe it's because of the nature of the other people that we've discussed in the course of the show, but he seems very grounded and
yeah.
normal, the kind of guy you could have a cup of coffee and a chat with.
I know, and it totally clashes against then what we'll talk about in terms of the extravagance that happened under his watch. But I think an awful lot of that can be explained. Now, some people don't believe the explanations, but I do. But anyway, we will get into that. So, Kozlowski takes over the company. At this stage, they have 4 distinct divisions. Tyco is a very boring company. The more I read about it, there's nothing exciting goes on at Tyco. There are 4 divisions for electrical and electrical components, fire services, specialty products, and flow control like pipes and drains. And Kozlowski, when he became CEO, he recognized pretty quickly that 81% of their revenue was coming from the construction sector, which is really cyclical. So strategically, he decided to broaden what they offered, but still within those 4 key business sectors. So he broadened their offerings into health and security, which, would protect them against the cyclical nature of the construction industry. And then he went on, we talked about 1982 to 1992, they grew from, 20 million in revenue up to 3 billion. So that's significant growth. But man, after Kozlowski became CEO, they started growing massively. Like over his tenure, they bought about 1,000 companies. In the last few years of when he was CEO, they were averaging about 200 acquisitions a year. And he got the nickname Deal a Day Dennis. And he was very clear on his rules. Only buy companies that they're very familiar with and that fit within those 4 business sectors. And also no hostile takeovers. Unlike his predecessor, he thought when you buy a company, it's a hostile takeover, an awful lot of the talent tends to leave the company that you're buying. So he was very clear on that. Now, they were doing all these deals. They did, in fairness, from what I read, they tested the limits of acceptable accounting and tax practices when they were doing all these acquisitions. But they actually wore that as a badge of honor, that, they did push the limits here. But as we shall see, that probably comes back to bite them badly in terms of the trials that go on. But they paid very well. And very much based on a pay for performance.
Yeah, that was a big part of what Kozlowski believed in, that you rewarded performance. And generously rewarded performance, and nobody more generous than him, I guess.
But he paid his executives really, really well, as said, based on their performance. And I think the figure we have is that 90% of his earnings came from his performance, were based on performance. And of course, when they're growing at such a massive rate and they're doing so well, yes, he's going to be handsomely paid. And in 2000, his take home was $137 million. And by that stage, he had shares worth about $670 million. So he was a massively, massively wealthy man. But he had grown the company from 3 billion, 30 billion. They had a market cap of 130 billion. Things were going so well that the board around this time, 2001, thought, we have possibly the best CEO in America. And he was widely lauded at that time as one of the best CEOs. And they thought, we want to hold on to him. So they put together this retention agreement. And the retention agreement stipulated that he would be guaranteed 3 times his 2000 salary, which was 137 million by 3, 411 million, plus other stocks and options that came to about 80 million. So you're talking about the bones of $500 million by agreeing to stay with the company until 2008. He was guaranteed this. Even if in the meantime, the board decided to sack him, the only thing that would stop him from getting that payment as if he was convicted of a felony.
So it doesn't take a huge leap to join the dots there, in terms
No.
of here's this potentially punitive situation with a CEO. Then things start to unravel, and here's a solution to that potentially.
Well, I mean, that's it. It seems nearly too simplistic, but that's what I believe will happen. We'll talk with more of it because it seems like as soon as they signed the retention deal, this is in 2001, then everything went wrong for Tyco because first of all, they bought a financial services company called CIT for $9.2 billion. Now that broke their Kozlowski's golden rule. It didn't fit within their 4 business sectors. And it wasn't a business that they knew anything about. Now, Kozlowski, up to this day, I've seen interviews with him, Keith, where he still maintained that it did fit within their business because it was a financial services company that would allow their customers to borrow money so that they could buy
their kit. Yeah.
That might make sense in that way, but it doesn't fit within their 4 sectors. And
and you'd wonder, the other theme, I suppose, in the book or sub-theme is the fact that Tyco was modeling itself as GE or like a GE light, and GE money or GE finance, of course, was a huge division of the GE brand. So you would wonder how much of that decision was driven by the fact that they were trying to emulate what GE were doing at the time or the success that GE.
I think that's very true. Throughout the book and even throughout interviews that I read with Kozlowski before the scandal hit, Kozlowski mentions GE all the time. I think back then people looked to GE as the gold standard in terms of how corporations were run. This was when Jack Welch was in charge. And I think you're 100% right. I think they saw what GE were doing I think it was GE Capital. Half of GE revenue or profits were coming from GE Capital. And they looked at that and thought, we want a piece of that. And it was a huge mistake. It was a huge mistake, not just strategically. It was a huge mistake as well for this little incident that happened as a result of the CIT deal, because a board director named Frank Walsh was the guy who negotiated or put Kozlowski in contact with the CIT CEO because he knew the CIT CEO. So he facilitated the meeting, he facilitated the negotiations between Tyco and CIT. Now, usually that kind of work is handled by an investment bank. And the investment bank will get a fee, usually about 1% of the overall cost of the acquisition, which in this situation, or for this deal, it came to 9.2 billion. So an investment bank would expect to get about 92 million. Now, Frank Walsh did this as a board director in a very informal way. Himself and Kozlowski agreed that he would get some sort of fee. There was nothing really, from what I can gather, that was ironed out until after the deal went through and they sat down again and negotiated a deal whereby Frank Walsh got 10 million himself and 10 million that he could give to a charity of his choice. It was handled very informally, but an invoice was produced by Frank Walsh. It went through the financial department of Tyco. It was paid, except for one little wrinkle. And the wrinkle was that Kozlowski didn't mention it to the board until 6 months after the CIT deal. And this is when certain board members really just got very, very annoyed about it. Now, you would think they were annoyed about it because, there's a huge conflict here. Here's a board member getting a payment for work he did with Tyco. But the conflicts within the board Tyco were commonplace. There was one board member who had a legal firm, and his law firm handled all the mergers and acquisitions for Tycos, and they were earning millions. There was
and somebody else had a fleet of airplanes or something like that.
Exactly. Not only that guy had a fleet of airplanes that he leased to Tyco, and his company made loads of money. But his wife was what we call in Ireland a real estate agent. I think in America they say a
realtor.
And she handled all the relocation because there was a lot of relocation going on for Tyco employees because they moved headquarters. And she handled all the relocation, and she was making loads of money.
Yeah.
So conflicts abounded on the Tyco board. And actually, they didn't put in a rule or a clause to prevent directors from making money off Tyco until like about 6 or 8 months after all this. So it wasn't because of conflict.
It must have been just the size of the check, really.
I would say it was the size of the check. And I remember I was talking to you about this last week, and you made a good point. Not only the size of the check, but it also went directly to Frank Walsh, whereas the guy who owned the law firm, his legal firm would have made millions. And, obviously he would have got a bit of those profits, and the guy who owned the airplanes or the helicopters, again, it went into his company. Whereas with Frank Walsh, it went directly to Frank Walsh. And
Yes.
And I'd say overall, from what I can gather, he didn't do a whole lot for his 10 million. He made a few calls and it seemed like
So two things kind of fired off in my mind as you were saying that. I was wondering who the charity was.
Yeah, didn't find out.
And did they laud Walsh and sort of make him look like it's a very generous benefactor? Did that rub people up the wrong way? Cynical part of my mind wondered about that.
It could have been that.
But the other thing about it, I suppose, is it's important to say that the board had given Kozlowski the discretion to spend, without any board approval, $200 million.
This is it. The board, or the board, even in future testimony, 5 board directors said that Kozlowski had total authority to pay that fee to Frank Walsh, and that he had given fees or paid fees to investment banks who had worked on other mergers and acquisitions without any problem. And as we mentioned just a minute ago, there was no issue with a conflict because there was no rule in relation to conflict. And actually, there was a funny story where Roger Most, who was an eminent corporate governance expert and was a director on Tyco up until 1994, because in 1994, he proposed to the board that they do this self-evaluation so that there would no longer be any conflicts on the board. And as soon as he proposed this, he was asked to leave the board. So, so the board had no problem with conflicts. I think you're right. I think it was just down to jealousy. Some of the directors just didn't like it. And so they had this meeting in January where they discussed a few things. One of the things was the CIT deal, because this was 6 months after the deal, because by even 6 months into the deal, the CIT deal was going very, very badly. And they also discussed the Frank Walsh payment. And at this meeting, some board members were happy with Frank Walsh to take it because they could see that it was no different to what other directors were doing anyway. But some board directors insisted that Frank Walsh either give back the money or leave the board. And apparently Frank Walsh stood up, said adios, and left the boardroom, and that was it. And at that same meeting, Kozlowski did apologize because it was handled in a very informal way, and he could see that some of the board members were really pissed off. So he apologized for the way he handled this. He offered his resignation, but the board members rejected his resignation, and they also then put the Frank Walsh payment into Tyco's proxy statement and explained what it was for. So they had no reservations about it really that were valid or legal in any sense. They were just a bit pissed off, some of them, because I think of the size of it. And that would have been, you think, case closed, except this was January 2002, and what happened in December 2001. And when shareholders saw the proxy statement of the director, Frank Walsh had been paid $20 million for his involvement in the CIT deal. The shareholders got very annoyed and they sued Tyco. And it was only on the back of that then the board decided we got to cover our ass. So they hired David Boys to investigate the Frank Walsh payment. Now, I don't know what they wanted to investigate because everything about it seemed pretty clear-cut.
But did you get the impression from the book that there was not machinations as such, but there was a short seller circling around the company as well?
Oh, there was. And this was another thing. There was an awful lot swirling around Tyco at this time. The CIT deal was going south. Kozlowski had even proposed breaking Tyco up into four to generate shareholder value. There was also a short seller had made complaints about the way in which they were reporting some of their profits in relation to, or some of the expenses in relation to their acquisitions. I'm not quite sure the details. And the SEC did open an investigation into this. And they closed their investigation with no charges.
Yes.
But there was all this kind of this publicity, and it seems with hindsight, like it was a perfect storm was brewing and it was heading in Tyco's way. And looking back at it now, of course, at that time, they were just firefighting all these separate issues. But I mean, what the board really, by opening up an investigation into Frank Walsh and bringing David Boys, who we mentioned before, by this stage, people who aren't familiar, David Boys was the preeminent litigator in America at this stage. He featured heavily in an episode that we haven't released yet, but he was in the Microsoft antitrust case, where he really brought Bill Gates to his knees. So this guy, bringing him in, really opened up Tyco, I think, to what was to happen to them and left them very vulnerable in one way, but another way, bringing in David Boyes seemed to work very well for the boards.
For the company,
Yeah. So David Boyes was brought in to investigate the Frank Walsh payments. In he comes. And then around June in 2002, Kozlowski is involved in buying art. Now, he himself, I've read interviews and where he kind of says he should never have got involved in art. He was only doing it for bragging rights.
Yes.
But he had so much money and he wanted to be seen as an art collector, so he started buying art. At the same time that he was buying art, the Manhattan DA was investigating certain New York or Manhattan art galleries because they suspected that they weren't charging sales tax.
Yes.
Now, this is where it gets a bit complicated, a bit tricky, because up to now, and has always been the case in sales tax, the onus is on the seller to charge tax. It's not on the buyer to pay the tax. But for some reason, when the DA were doing their investigations in New York art galleries, they came across Kozlowski buying paintings. And instead of charging the galleries for not charging tax on what they sold to Kozlowski, they went after Kozlowski and they indicted Kozlowski. Now, as Catherine Neal says in her book, he was the first ever customer in New York. So in other words, the person on the other end of purchase to be charged with not paying tax. And this really leads me to believe that the DA in this post-Enron era saw Kozlowski, the biggest and perhaps most well-known CEO, or one of them anyway, at that time, and thought, this is our way of getting him. I can't understand any other way, because it should be noted that this sales tax, even though it wasn't much reported when the case closed in 2004, 2 years later, Kozlowski was cleared of this. And not only that.
And wasn't it something to do with like where the paintings were shipped and then reshipped to? So they went from the gallery to like New Hampshire or somewhere and then came back again.
There was some complications in there, but ultimately the judge who cleared Kozlowski in 2004 on the sales tax charge was very critical of the Manhattan DA for their inappropriate interpretation of the law. But this is what started it all, because he got indicted on these sales tax charges. And so he had to ring the board and tell the board, I'm going to be indicted on Monday morning for the sales tax. And the board...
But sorry, Kevin, just to clarify, indicted is charged.
Charged.
Yeah, so, as opposed to being convicted or something. So
yes, he was. And he had to ring the board. I jumped ahead there and sort of said, just to let people know how erroneous even being considered to be indicted on these charges were, because he was ultimately cleared of them. But back in 2002, anyway, in summer 2002, he had to ring the board and say, I'm going to be indicted on these sales tax charges. I know, and he did know nothing about what was going on in relation to this. And his lawyer was even saying nothing will come of this because the onus on you. But anyway, when he rang the board had a telephone meeting between themselves over the weekend, and some board members thought, well, we should put him on leave until we know what's going on here. But other board members who won the day pushed that, no, he should resign. They effectively fired him. They forced him to resign the company. What's very interesting is that in a 2011 interview that one of the board directors gave, they admitted that during that phone conversation on the sales tax, what was top of their mind
was the retention agreement.
Was the retention agreement, because they knew if he goes, and unless he is convicted of a felony, we are going to have to pay him the bones of nearly $500 million. Now, they were already in deep trouble over the $20 million that they paid to Frank Walsh. So they knew in this post-Enron era, where public and the media were so up against corporations, that they would be in big trouble if they had to go ahead and pay this. So as soon as they told Kozlowski that he had to go, and they just cut him off completely, they asked Boyd to broaden his investigation that he was doing into Frank Walsh, and to broaden it to investigate Kozlowski as well. So,
and this is where you probably have the most sympathy for him as an individual, a guy who's built the company and through circumstances that are somewhat murky, finds himself forced to resign, does so reasonably honorably, I would say. He seems like quite, he comes across as an honorable guy. And then he's in a position where he can cash in his contract, and suddenly there's a scramble to throw mud and see what'll stick.
Exactly. And like, as you said, like, he worked that company for 27 years. He built up that company and grew that company massively. And an awful lot of those board members made a lot of money on the back of his success. And they just cut him loose. They never talked to him again, apparently, after that. Cut him completely loose. He wasn't allowed to get access to Tyco, company cars gone, everything straight away. He was cut off completely. I found it pretty inexplicable.
The other thing it's probably important to say is his life and the company were so interwoven. That's the other thing that comes through in the book. So, the management of his personal finances, even his bank accounts, his credit cards, were all done by people within the company.
Yeah, the executive treasury had.
Yeah, exactly. So it seemed as if essentially he was a machine to make deals happen. He didn't really appear to have much of a social life. Well, a little bit of a social life, but really a machine to generate wealth and progress for the company. His life must have been shattered, I think.
I would say it was. And it was only going to get worse for him, because then Boyes did this report. David Boyes did this report, and he started working with the Manhattan DA. So he was giving the details of his report to the Manhattan DA, but only giving the Manhattan DA details that they wanted that would build the case against Kozlowski. And this is another wrinkle in the whole thing. He didn't have to give them everything. And the prosecution didn't want really any interviews or notes that would be favorable to Kozlowski, because in a criminal trial, if they had any notes that were favorable to Kozlowski, they'd have to give it to the defense.
Yeah.
But because they were getting it from Boyes could basically filter the information they could get. So the prosecution need only get information that was damaging to Kozlowski. And so when the defense said, well, let me see all your notes, they'd say, here are all our notes. But they didn't have all the information either, because Boyes had all the information. And Boyes' report was very quickly leaked to the media. And this is where we get into the Dennis Kozlowski that the public are aware of, because the report, the details from the report are scandalous. They are, there's no other way to put it. They are scandalous. They detail and they accused Dennis Kozlowski of basically taking money from Tyco. And I'll just give a few examples. Taking money from Tyco and buying a $17 million Fifth Avenue apartment, then spending $16 million on furnishing that apartment. Mm-hmm. Included in these furnishings were a $15,000 dog umbrella stand. $6,300. Yeah, at $6,000. I don't even know what a dog umbrella stand is, but a $6,300 sewing basket. Of course, the infamous $6,000 shower curtain. Those paintings were $2 million. Those more paintings were $12.5 million. 5 paintings that he bought. And then there was this infamous party that he was accused of using Tyco's money for. It cost $2 million. It was for his wife's 40th birthday. It was over in Sardinia, and he was accused of doing that, of taking Tyco's.
I saw some of the footage of the party, actually, and it is pretty. You could imagine how it would have inflamed people. There was half-naked men knocking around, and there was sort of a life-size sculpture of somebody, and it was like a giant toga party.
Yes, it was. And I mean, Kozlowski himself admitted that he was embarrassed by that party. He had nothing to do with the organization of that party other than to say, yeah, he asked for a themed party. But we will get into, what he paid for and what he didn't pay for and all that. But, it was scandalous. And this was flashed all over the media. The high point of it, I suppose, or the low point for Kozlowski's point of view, was a photo of him on the front page of the New York Post. And then in big bold letters, the headline, oink, oink.
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
that was Kozlowski. That's how he was perceived, as this greedy corporate pig, really, is the way the media
Yeah.
portrayed him. And on the back of this report, anyway, the Manhattan DA charged 4 directors or 4 executives in Tyco. They charged Frank Walsh with the 20 million fee for not getting board approval. They charged Mark Belnick, who was the chief counsel, for taking a $14 million bonus without approval. And they charged Kozlowski and the CFO, Mark Swartz, with taking $132 million in 4 bonuses that weren't approved. Now, what's crucial about this, Keith, and it is mentioned in the Catherine Neal book, is that up to now, in the Enron case, in the WorldCom case, in all these big scandals, it was the federal government who took these cases. Okay? In this case, it wasn't. The federal government looked at this and declined to press charges. So you have the federal government who's involved in all these big corporate scandals and, taking down Jeff Skilling and Bernie Ebbers, all these. They look at the Tyco rap sheet and they're going, no, nothing to see here. And I am guessing, right, that the reason why is because, first of all, if we get back to the report where they did say Kozlowski took money from Tyco and bought the apartment and bought these paintings and bought all these furnishings and paid for this party. Yeah, he did take Tyco's money and he did buy the apartment and it was in Tyco's name.
Yes.
He did buy all these furnishings and they were in Tyco's name.
Yeah, I could feel myself as you were saying that about to jump to his defense. Hang on, these are assets on the books of Tyco. What did he steal?
They are all assets on Tyco's. Now, he had the authority as well, and he had the authority to spend 200 million. So, he had the authority to spend this money. He spent this. He spent Tyco's money, and all these assets were still in Tyco's.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I thought, oh my God, so he's personally interested in art, and he goes off and he buys art for this apartment. And then you start to pull the thread and think it's quite common for corporations to buy art. They weren't unique.
It is. No, very, very common. Now, 5 of the paintings that were in that apartment, 3 of the paintings were bought by Tyco and belonged to Tyco. 5 of the paintings were bought by Kozlowski and belonged to Kozlowski, which he never actually got in the end. They held on to them, but he used them. He got a loan from Tyco, and we'll talk about the loans because this is where it gets a bit complicated. But he got a loan from Tyco, which he paid back, and he used it to buy 5 paintings that hung in the apartment. So, but everything else in the apartment belonged to Tyco.
And then the other part of it is this apartment. And again, I'm mindful a little bit, but according to Kozlowski, because of the sensitive nature of some of the deals for the businesses that they were acquiring, they had to meet somewhere private. And because he was well known and increasingly well known, even before the scandal, anybody he met would immediately cause a flurry of speculation. So he needed somewhere private to meet. So a convenient Manhattan apartment that they could have catering in, etc., was perfect. Even in a hotel, they were a little bit exposed.
It was, and and the CIT deal was done there. An awful lot of their big deals was done there. And Kozlowski didn't stay in the apartment all that much. And also in relation to the furnishings, he not stupidly. I mean, people, actually, I'll take that back, not stupidly at all. He delegated the whole design and interior and the furnishings and everything to an interior designer. Now, he did let it go over budget. That was probably a bit foolish. But I mean, Tyco was swimming in money. But he didn't know. He said, he admits he never even knew about the shower curtain. Never even used the shower where the shower curtain hung. It was down in one of the bedrooms downstairs or whatever. So, yeah, he delegated, as you would if you're a guy earning 137 million a year and you're doing 200 deals a year. You're not going to nitpick over what goes into an apartment that you're not even living in. That's there really just so to facilitate meetings.
Yeah, and he didn't even manage his own personal finances, let alone something at that level of detail.
No, sure. I mean, when all this shit hit the fan, he had to ring the person in the executive treasury to find out not only his bank details, but also to find out his social security number. She testified in the stand he didn't even know his social security number. That's how much he delegated everything and how far removed he was from the normal everyday stuff that most of us deal with. And in relation to the party, this is the big one. Everybody said, he threw a party for his wife and Tyco paid $2 million for it. The party was a 40th birthday party, but it was also combined with a Tyco getaway, which they did many times throughout the year. The party planner said that Tyco took its employees to luxurious resorts a few times a year at a cost of $2 million. In relation to this specific one, it was a 40th birthday party for his wife. Half the guests were his and his family, and half were Tyco employees. He paid for half it. Tyco paid for half it. So, like, there was all these charges, but when you dig down into it, the federal government were looking at these and kind of going, okay, nothing to see here. And then they also looked at the allegedly stolen 4 bonuses. And I'm guessing they looked at it and thought, well, these bonuses are derived from formulas that were agreed upon in advance. They are accused of taking large bonuses that were due to them. The only note here is that they weren't approved by the compensation committee, but everything else about them is legit. And I'm assuming the federal government thought it's going to be very hard to prove criminal intent here. But apparently
there was a precedent, right? So there was a historical precedent to the payment of these bonuses.
Yeah, exactly. They've been paid bonuses, maybe not as large, but bonuses in the exact same way for 9 years up to then.
And the board, as a rule, were sloppy in their minutes and their note keeping anyway. So it wouldn't have necessarily been that but unusual.
Well, this is it. And we get to the noble vision. We try not to bog the listeners down in too much detail. There was a trial. The Frank Walsh trial happened, first of all. Frank Walsh, mysteriously, I can't understand. He pleaded guilty to fraud. He had to pay back. This happened in early 2002. So this was the first trial. He pleaded guilty. He paid back $20 million as well as a $2.5 million fee. I don't know why he pleaded guilty, because 2 years later in Kozlowski's trial, 5 directors testified that Kozlowski had total authority to pay that fee. So I'm not too sure what happened there. But the second trial is interesting. This was Mark Belnick. He was the chief counsel, and he was accused of taking a $14 million bonus without approval. Now, he was cleared, and I've got 2 quotes here from 2 jurors as to why they cleared him. This is from the first juror. He said, all the directors and committees didn't do their jobs. They can't have it both ways. They either did their job and knew what was going on, or they didn't. So that's the reason why they cleared him. He said that the board, screwed up.
Yeah.
Then the second juror really gets to the nub of it. The second juror says, everything that he got, Mark Belnick got, was documented through emails and memos with the company's signature. The evidence we had satisfied us that he got it the right way. So based on what the jurors thought there, they didn't believe the board, and they did believe the records of Tyco to show that this bonus was known, and whether the compensation committee actually, gave their seal of approval on it was really irrelevant, because everything else above it was above board. And on the back of Belnick being cleared, the DA offered Kozlowski and Swartz a plea deal, but they rejected it. So then we get to the trial. There was a first trial. We won't even get into that because it was declared a mistrial for bizarre reasons. The first trial lasted 6 months. The second trial then starts in January 2005 and lasts for 5 months. And as you said, there are things here that just don't make sense. I mean, by the time we get to this trial, though, it should be made clear that Kozlowski's image was dirt, and everybody in New York would have known about Kozlowski, because in the 2002 especially, and then during the trial in 2004, the first trial that was declared a mistrial, his name, the reports, his extravagance, all that would have plastered all over the media. So his public image wasn't. And the DA did have the board testifying against him. The DA also had the board saying that there was no minutes from the compensation committee, so ergo, we didn't approve it. And the DA also had these very complicated and blurred lines between Kozlowski's and Swartz's personal finances and the company finances. But Kozlowski said, in relation to the board not knowing, he said he did mention the bonuses to Philip Hampton, who was the chair of the compensation committee, and that Philip Hampton said that he had okayed them with the board. Now, crucially, Philip Hampton died in 2001. So there's no way of verifying if he told the board. Okay. In relation to the minutes, though, you mentioned it, like the board saying that there was no minutes for the compensation committee, or at least that the approval of the bonuses weren't minutes in the company, holds zero water at all, because Catherine Neal in her book has a litany of incidents where minutes aren't taken. The audit committee in Tyco, for the whole 10 years that Kozlowski was in charge, never once kept minutes. The compensation committee was meant to meet 4 times a year. They only met once a year. And the minutes for that meeting were prepared before the meeting, by an executive who didn't sit in on the meeting. And then they were approved by the compensation board members weeks or sometimes even months after the meeting. And then in relation to just big issues that were never minuted in Tyco board minutes, the hiring of David Boyes was never minuted. The instruction to include Kozlowski in David Boyes' investigation was never minuted. The meeting that they had with Kozlowski in January to discuss the Frank Walsh deal, to discuss breaking Tyco up into 4, that was never minuted. There was an incident where Tyco decided to sell $2 billion worth of shares to Lehman Brothers. That was never minuted. And there's loads of incidents. So this idea that, well, they weren't mentioned in the minutes, therefore they weren't approved, that doesn't hold any water. But I think the one thing, Keith, when I went through all the testimony, the blurred lines between Kozlowski and Schwartz's personal finance, and also the way in which the bonuses were paid, it was very, I would say it wasn't above board. It was the way Tyco had always done it, but they used this system called KELP, which is the Key Employment Loan Program, which is where employees could get loans to pay off some of the taxes due on shares that were vested. And it is fair to say that Kozlowski and Schwartz abused that system. They took loads of loans. Now, they paid off all the loans. I think Kozlowski, over the course of his 10 years, took something like $250 million in loans from KELP. Now, they were all paid back, but it it didn't look right. And there were issues with how these loans were accounted for and declared on Tyco's books. Now, they weren't all declared, but it all looked a bit murky, and that didn't help their case.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it was a very blurred line. And I guess even as we're talking through this, you feel how could, when you're looking at his antique yacht and you're looking at the art, how could a jury of peers be sympathetic in some respects? To this character, particularly as he'd been portrayed in the media. I mean, I know jury's supposed to be isolated from media and not have any prejudice and such, but that combined with the corporate failures that you've already mentioned, like WorldCom and Enron, it felt like in some respects, despite the mitigating facts, the conclusion at the end of the trial was almost inevitable.
Yeah, and they had a lot going against them because as in their testimony, because of these blurred lines and because of the poor corporate governance, which we used to sort of show, well, the board couldn't go stand behind that. Well, that went against Kozlowski and Schwartz as well. And that is on Kozlowski's head because he was in charge at the time. He didn't like bureaucracy. He mentioned himself in one interview that Tyco went from childhood, adulthood, without going through adolescence. In other words, they didn't have the processes in place. They didn't have the layers of bureaucracy really that you need in a big corporation like that, because he was so intent on growing massively and letting nothing get in his way. But that worked against him because there were so many incidents in the stand where Schwartz and Kozlowski didn't have the paperwork to prove what they were saying. I could only say, I don't know about that. I did say this, but I got no record of it. And that worked against them. And one of the things as well, which wasn't mentioned in the book, and it really worked against Kozlowski in the trial, was that he failed to include a $25 million payment in his tax returns. Now, here you have this successful businessman, not only successful, he was a trained auditor. That somebody who's a trained auditor forgets to put $25 million in his taxes. For a lot of people, and I'm sure for the jury and the public, that's not credible. And I know I'll go against the grain here. For me, it is credible. And I'll tell you why. First of all, we know from all the evidence we have with Kozlowski that he delegated everything. He delegates everything. And his accountant didn't spot that $25 million. Okay, so I'm going on that. But I'm also going on the fact, Keith, I remember when we ran our tiny, tiny company, and we had an accountant. And I remember every year that accountant would do my taxes. And every year he'd hand me all my tax forms and all that. And he'd say, Cayman, read through that thoroughly, be 100% satisfied that you're happy with everything in that before you sign that and send it in to the tax office. And I didn't. I just went to the back page, signed it, and that was it. And that was because A, I hated doing taxes. B, I was really busy. And C, I trusted the accountant 100%. Now, that was stupid, but that's the way I did it. So I can totally see how somebody like Kozlowski, who is 10 times busier than even I was back then, and who delegated everything, would just get his tax form, trust his accountant, sign it, and send it off. But I can also see how other people would see that as being totally not credible. And that really, I think, damaged his credibility inside the courtroom.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was alluded to in the book, though, was it?
No, she didn't mention it, which is a big omission.
Interesting.
There were a few things that the author didn't mention.
But shall we guess? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there was one incident as well, because we pointed that as being Kozlowski being totally not credible. But there was one incident with the boards that is totally not credible that came up in the trial as well. And this is where the board member testified, I think it was John Ford, testified that weeks after learning about the bonuses that the board's claim they realized had been stolen, they still kept Swartz as the CFO. They had him certify accounts and they paid him a $50 million severance payment. Effectively, what this means is that if you were running a company and you believed that your CFO had stolen from your company, would you keep the CFO working for you? Would you have them certify your accounts? And would you then pay him $50 million in severance? Because that's what Tyco and the board directors are asking us to believe. So that is just not credible at all.
But anyway, shall we get to the conclusion then?
Yeah. I mean, as you said, it was inevitable the jury found him guilty, didn't they?
Yeah. And pretty harsh, like, was it 18 to 25 years?
It was 8 1/3, 25 years. And they were also fined, because Kozlowski was fined $167 million, and Swartz had to pay back $72 million. They also lost 2 appeals in the way the authors tells it in the book, you would feel that they were very hard done by in the appeals. Because again, and I did read one of the appeals, and the judges focused on testimony of the boards, and they also focused on the artwork. Again, that Kozlowski had bought, and that was in Tyco's name. I don't understand that. I mean, what's your take on all this? Because it wasn't the story I expected to be telling.
I left the book somewhat enraged in terms of feeling a sense of injustice, I must say. I thought he's a pretty unsympathetic character in a lot of ways. He led a luxury lifestyle. He was an auditor who should have known better. But on balance, it's hard to not have sympathy for a guy. That was my conclusion. And thinking maybe he was a victim of bad timing and sloppiness in a climate of corporate greed. Who came face to face with a DA who liked the limelight and wanted to make a name for themselves as well in the white collar crime world, and who had a reputation.
Yeah. I would 100% get behind that. One thing I forgot to mention, and an awful lot of critics will also say, but Kozlowski in his second parole hearing admitted guilt. And yes, he did, but that was his second parole hearing. In his first parole hearing, he didn't admit guilt, and he wasn't released, and he was looking at another 17 years in jail with his reputation already in tatters.
And he developed some health complications as well at that stage. So I think he probably just wanted to get out of there.
He did. And one thing that I got out of this as well, Keith, I 100% agree with everything you said there in terms of it was the climate at the time, there was sloppiness involved. I think a lot of, I suppose, credit might be the wrong word, but it's the word I'll use. Credit has to be given to David Boyes as well, in that he was hired by the board to protect them. And at this time, in 2002, protection meant we cannot pay this retention agreement. Yes. And, he got paid $45 million over 3 years to protect the board. Now, ultimately, the board ended up paying something like $3 billion in civil cases as a result of these criminal convictions. But that was 6 or 7 years later, where the post-Enron hysteria had moved on. But his immediate concern was to protect the board. And, hats off, he did a good job, but at what expense to Kozlowski? And I would say at what expense to justice as well.
Yeah, I suppose the other point that probably gets forgotten in a lot of the commentary is this was a real company. This wasn't cards.
No, and it's still going.
And it's still going, okay, albeit sort of much reduced and divisions have been sold off, etc. But this was a real company with real revenues and real success.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought it was a fascinating story for the reasons that I didn't expect it to be fascinating.
Exactly. Great read. All right. Cool.
Nice work.
Talk to you.
I'll talk to you, Keith. Have a good one. Bye.